And of course, I mean, latterly, BKS Iyengar did it himself. I mean, I think in the early days, I think he wasn't bringing too much of the yoga, kind of like yoga philosophy and the Patanjali, but latterly, obviously, BKS Iyengar gets quite heavily involved with, kind of Hinduism and bringing things back. I mean, an interesting idea, which might be relevant to discuss, is what do we mean when we say Hinduism and the neo-Hinduism, or the conversion with Vivekananda and the Brahmo Arya Samaj in this period, and how does that influence the presentation of yoga? Because that would also tie into Iyengar and Iyengar's thoughts on it, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's a very, very profound and important question, because the underlying issue is sort of the politics of religion and the politicization of religion in various institutionalized forms, as complicated in terms of differences throughout the 20th century and actually the 19th century and earlier as well. So there's no easy way around it, but it's an important point because it's always very important to understand the context within which yoga was being practiced in dialogue with these discourses of religious institutionalization, I would okay. And with very broad strokes, and these are very, very broad strokes, I would characterize it as a movement throughout the 20th century that shifted from one that was more anti-colonial and therefore promoting Hindu and in other contexts, Islamic beliefs as the counterpoint to the underlying, what you might call Christian hegemony associated with colonialism, to one that was more nationalist in a insular and more narrow and, I would say, highly problematic exclusionary mode. And what you see in Shivananda in particular is certainly in the 1950s and 1960s, a very cosmopolitan approach to the advocacy of what has become Hinduism as a term which, is more narrow than he applied it. But Vedanta in the broadest sense, and the interpretation of the scriptures in order to try and connect them to beliefs in other parts of the world, rather than to claim their uniqueness and their insularity as something that was distinctively and exclusively and therefore narrowly Hindu in that sense. So throughout the 20th century, it becomes more and more nationalist. And what you find, unfortunately, which is that, advocates for yoga who link it to Hindu nationalism end up making an argument that excludes it from what it has really become, which is a global form of self-development that really nobody can control anymore. But it's become an issue of the politics of who controls the terms of that practice.
Yeah.
And certainly contemporary nationalism has
definitely got its teeth into that. Yeah, with Yoga Day and Modi. And I mean, but even I think I wrote an obituary for the Times in the UK of BKS Iyengar, and he definitely had some interest in nationalism and let's put it lightly. There was a flicker of something there. But go back to Vivekananda again. So how does he? What was the? Can we put our finger on the original kind of framework within the would it have been the original framework of Ramakrishna, who was obviously guru of Vivekananda, who was talking about yoga in terms of Ramakrishna was very magical in many respects, and then where does Vivekananda suddenly get this kind of these kind of rather Christian ideas about Hinduism, right? That he's presenting to the World Congress, and can we clarify or is there a sudden change, a sea change at that point in terms of the framework in which yoga is being kind of understood? And we're talking about modern postural yoga.
Yeah. No, I mean, it really is the point at which to put the focus for the question. And again, to overstate it and to run rather roughshod over fine points of history, what I would say is that the genius of Vivekananda was to see beyond nationalism. Even though he was very much a nationalist and was doing things which promoted a nationalist, anti-colonial form of self-development. What really is significant is that he, amongst others, were looking beyond nationalism. And I've made this point about Gandhi as well. I mean, Gandhi is recognized as a figure who defines modern Indian independence, but his genius was to see beyond the problem of national boundaries. And I think that ultimately Vivekananda can be understood in terms that really take that issue seriously, which is to recognize the cosmopolitan nature of his contribution. That is, he was thinking globally about yoga, drawing on inspiration which came from Ramakrishna and his education in Calcutta and so forth, but that he imagined the possibility of something that put yoga on par with the traditions of soteriology and philosophy, actually, that weren't as an argument against the West, but were an alternative to something that had been so thoroughly framed by Orientalism that it was impossible for many people to see outside that box. And Vivekananda's genius was to see outside the box. Now, there are many problems with him. I don't mean to characterize him as a genius without, flaws. But there's an important point there with regard to why his significance has carried through into the 21st century. I hear myself being an advocate for Vivekananda, which I had never thought myself to be. But it's true, I mean.
But hasn't he just completely? Sorry, I was just going to say that didn't he completely change the original ideas that we find in Hinduism, right, and convert them to a kind of transcendental, kind of naturalist kind of philosophy, which is completely other.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think that what the influences to trace out the influences on Vivekananda's thinking or on Sri Aurobindo's thinking is incredibly important and complex. And what I resist, even in my own, certainly in my own work, but whenever I'm reading scholarly work on these figures, is to resist the temptation to see them as simply derivatives of sort of colonial discourses and to see their arguments as limited by the intellectual framework of colonialism to which they were subject. But Aurobindo and Vivekananda and Gandhi and so many others were inspired by things that can be better understood without framing it in that way. However, fantastical and sometimes outlandish certain ideas were. They were thinking outside the box of colonialism, even though everybody seeks to put them back into that box time and time and time again.
Right. Okay. What about B.K.S. Iyengar? Can you say something about him as a figure on the scene and his his influences? Yeah,
really, obviously one of the if not the most important figures in terms of the globalization of postural practice. And when I was writing my book on yoga in modern India, I made a fairly deliberate decision not to try and integrate his practice into my research, simply because I recognized that his influence was so profound that it really deserved its own focus and attention. Nevertheless, I mean, obviously he is very much a part of this historical process by which the physical transformation of the body and the possibilities associated with it can be experimented in different ways. And what I find fascinating about Iyengar is the precision, and unlike, I mean, not completely unlike, but different from Govalyanand and Yogendra, what Iyengar did was to regiment the precise terms under which asana should be performed in a way that transformed them into what sounds like a contradiction, which is the almost mathematical and mechanical precision of techniques that are only realized in terms of their ideal once you transcend those mechanical, mathematical precisions. And so it's really reading light on yoga and, the many books which detail exactly how you are supposed to and you must do X, Y, and Z is really, important in terms of understanding how these postures became so profound in terms of their iconic significance within postural practice.
I think you make an interesting point, actually. You've got kind of radical materialism going on in terms of the methodology, whereas it's completely anti-material in terms of the soteriological kind of emphasis at the end result. But I mean, the way that Iyengar talks about it, and Govalyananda, they're trying to kind of validate it, within the context of Western science, aren't they? And to kind of take it away from the kind of nebulous and kind of so-called outlandish claimants of the sorcerers of old, as it were.
Right.
But with the Iyengar, we really find the medicalization, don't we? I mean, the medicalization of the asana, and it doesn't seem to have much of a precedent. As I was talking to Jason Birch literally a couple of days ago, on the original the oldest texts on Ayurveda, for example, don't really kind of give the same kind of framework that we're finding with Iyengar, right? So, I mean, do you trace it back before Iyengar, this kind of modern medicalization of yoga?
That's a really interesting question. Yes and no. And clearly Jason and James and others who look into the early literature know this in much more detail than I do. But what's intriguing about the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and the Shiv Samhita and other, early modern, pre-modern texts is that they have medical implications. In other words, they say doing this posture or this technique will ensure that your digestion is good or that you will be cured of any poison. In other words, what we would term medical benefits are represented in the literature, but they aren't medicalized in the sense that that's the purpose, I would say. I mean, it's kind of an ancillary benefit, you might say, as a consequence of the way in which the body is transformed. So, curing the body of the effects of poison is not an end in itself. It's towards the goal of immortality, you might say, as being the ultimate form of transformation. So the medicalization, getting back to the heart of your question, the medicalization of yoga takes that possibility and links it to applied medical intervention in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And Sri Yogendra in particular is, I think, an interesting figure in this light, because he was doing two things that relate to the medicalization of yoga. One is drawing on biomedical research to apply techniques of yoga in order to produce efficacious results. So pranayam in order to alleviate various kinds of symptoms. But he was also drawing on the alternative medicines of, interestingly, the European tradition of nature cure. And I've written about this in several articles, but there's much more research that could be done on this, which is to look at the way in which Yogendra, in particular, but also Kuvalyanand, synthesized the practice of postural yoga and pranayam with nature cure and naturopathy as it came out of the German and Eastern European tradition of using the elements, earth, air, sunlight, water, and diet in order to cure all diseases. And so there's an interesting multi-dimensional aspect to the medicalization of yoga in the 1920s. But to bring it back to India specifically, the inspiration behind the medicalization of yoga in Yogendra and Kuvalyananda really has to be located in their guru, Madhav Das Ji, who was a judge in the High Court of Calcutta, who really got fed up with colonial nonsense, renounced the world, went off, left everything behind him, but ended up in Gujarat and became the guru of Yogendra and Kuvalyananda. But what he was doing was using pranayam to treat patients in the dates are important, 1916, 17, 18, during the influenza epidemic. When I think, and this is speculation, but somebody should go and look into this, using pranayam as the means by which to provide alternative healing for the problems associated with the symptoms of the flu during that pandemic. And Kuvalyananda and Yogendra both hint at the way in which they, as young disciples of Madhav Das Ji, worked in the clinic that Madhav Das Ji had established on the banks of the Narmada in order to treat, maybe not everybody, but ascetics who were part of that community of sannyasis. And that, to my mind, is really a focal point in understanding ultimately the inspiration that led to the medicalization of yoga. And of course, yoga and nature cure have been synthesized in the institutionalization of alternative medicine under the rubric of the government of India. So they're part of the same.
I suppose it must also mark the kind of shift in intentions as well, from when Madhya Das goes, he's said to have inevitably found his guru in the Himalaya, right? The Himalaya, and learned these esoteric, kind of practices whereby he could inevitably do things like, banish himself from photographs and all other kind of stuff, right? And yet, suddenly you find him taking these practices, the practices such as Theos Bernard in the 1940s, 50s documents, which are crazily kind of adept practices like sucking water up your ass and things like that, right? You can't do, especially if you're bloody ill. And suddenly there's this juncture again whereby you get characters like him and obviously later Iyengar treating people who are very ill, certainly not going to be doing any serious shat karma, like that, and using yoga very differently. So it's kind of fascinating how the trickle down effect happens.
Yeah. And I think, in Madhav Dasji's case, it's really an important point to keep in mind when looking at Vivekananda and Shivananda and others as well, which is that what seems to us, or many of us, to be a contradiction, that is, these fantastical notions of magical power on the one hand, and these applied medical forms of intervention on the other, that those don't necessarily have to produce discontinuity in our appreciation for the integrity of the thinking of these public intellectuals, I would call them. That what they were doing was bringing together things that had been forced apart by a whole spectrum of forces that characterize sort of modern thinking as it was carried into India by colonialism. And so that they were struggling to reconcile things that had been disjointed as a consequence of really the intellectual violence of Orientalism and colonialism.
That's interesting.
And what I see is really the inspired power of thinking that sometimes is so outlandish that it's hard to take seriously. But if you try and take seriously the possibility that somebody who is able to remove themselves from a picture is also able to imagine how breathing exercises might alleviate the symptoms of the flu, you can imagine just how much power there is in that articulation of the human imagination.
That's the anthropologist speaking in you.
No doubt.
As the philosopher, I would say, isn't it a contradiction of Samkhya thinking, which is immediately clear to separate Purusha Prakriti and almost, pejoratively so. Prakriti is something, it's an up and out mentality. The body is the problem, So you would think that it's a contradiction, them curing people and say, well, let's cure you to have a good life, when really the best, in terms of yoga philosophy as we find it in the ancient texts, the best idea is almost a yoga suicide, really. That's the aim, get out of this as soon as you can. But you're feeling that there can be a synthesis. I mean, maybe talk a little. Yeah. They mentioned finally a little bit about Samkhya. You mentioned that it's you don't think it was so dualistic. You think it was a colonialist mentality that kind of separated spirit from matter a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point to discuss, and one that gets into some complicated dimensions of sort of how to interpret philosophy and. I think one of the problems with understanding Samkhya is that fundamentally it's dualist. In other words, Prakriti and Purush. But I would say that it's fundamentally a different articulation of dualism from what has emerged out of Descartes and that tradition of dualism, mind-body. Mind-body is not what Samkhya dualism is about. And to see it that way is to run into all kinds of profound confusions. And so I think the simple answer is to say that to understand Samkhya and to understand the transformation of the body within the framework of that dualistic system, you have to think outside the framework of the traditions of Cartesian but to do so in a way that then doesn't take it to the opposite extreme, which is to say that it's the antithesis of it, the opposite. And what I see in Samkhya and Purush Prakriti issue is an interesting one, because if you follow through the logic of my own interpretation, I should say, not everybody, but in my reading of the literature, the problem is that Prakriti always reflects the possibility of Purush as an experiential possibility in its increasingly refined format. So Prakriti can be gross, it can be subtle. But as you move towards that subtle end of the Prakritic domain, Purush is reflected in that.
In Buddha.
increasingly in
Yeah.
ways that approximate that experience. You can never get to it through Prakriti, of course, but the reflection is there. And that's what I think, individuals like, and this is again overstating it, simplifying it.
Yeah.
But Vivekananda and Madhav Dasji and Kuvalyananda were all able to see that reflection as they got into that mode of the subtle. They were able to see the possibility of the transcendent in the reflections of it in Prakriti, in their gross body, in the purity of the gross body. And so what appear to us to be the contradictions of mind and body are better understood as the possibility of a reflection of one in the other at the point at which yoga has enabled you to experience that to the extent possible in the context of our mortality. And I don't know whether that helps to explain it, but certainly that's how I try and follow the logic of reasoning that is manifest in these thinkers as I understand them, which is not that they were trying to escape the body or escape materiality, but to perfect materiality so as to be able to see the reflection of transcendence as it is manifest in this world that we live in. Now, that sounds a bit too philosophical, I know, but
I like it. I mean, I like it. It's a very optimistic way of trying to reconcile the extremely ascetic basis of the tradition, where we see in Patanjali and some pretty severe kind of ideas about reality and how one basically just needs to escape it. With those Vivekananda and Yogendra and teaching people to live life, and as well as maybe go beyond the minimum material objects and aims and etc. etc. Yeah.
Right. No, I mean, that brings up an important point, which is that I think David Gordon White has really put his finger on, which is in the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the chapters on magic are confounding. People read them and dismiss them because they seem magical and outlandish. How can this possibly be part of this mystical form of experience? But if you perceive them as magic, as being the way in which the ideal of transcendence is manifest in these fantastical possibilities of material transformation, then at least the way I read it is to see the same struggle in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra as is manifest in Madhav Dasji and Shivananda and others. I mean, it's working towards the same perception.
Where does this leave the modern practitioner who's just going to, who's got a yoga practice or going to yoga classes, and now they're super confused, as often people sometimes people point the finger at people, at people like you and Mark Singleton and say, well, you've ruined yoga for me. I wanted to believe that it was, 5,000 years old, and it was come from the seals of the Indus Valley, etc., right? And I mean, how do people, kind of reconcile themselves with diverse information? And you talk about wrestling, and if the influence of wrestling on. I mean, people probably don't want to be thinking of themselves as doing wrestling in the morning. They want to be thinking of themselves as doing something spiritual in the morning. And you mentioned. I mean, I said I wasn't going to talk about this, but very, very briefly, you mentioned the internalization of the sacrifice, which might be a way to talk about this. I don't know.
I think that what practitioners can take away from all of the information that is available on the history of yoga is a critical understanding of the integrity of the different interpretations that have been experimented with over the 20th century and earlier centuries, and ultimately experience in the form of practice that you engage in is a measure of yoga's benefit. So there's no sense, my intellectual approach to the study of yoga is not in any sense meant to debunk anything. It simply is what you might call Jnana Yoga, which is, the intellectual approach to questioning questions that emerge through practice. So any practitioner who engages in pranayama, and I've talked to, dozens, if not more, who point out that they have benefited from this in ways that for them are inexplicable. And that is important because it grounds the experience in your experience as you have benefited from it. And that enables you to assimilate information that is produced by, scholars like Mallinson and Jason Birch and Singleton and, others who constantly push questions to better understand how these traditions have grown and developed. But in no sense to thereby force anybody to say, oh, well, then everything that I have experienced is meaningless. Absolutely not. It can't be, because the experience is the foundation of your self-transformation. So, there are levels of reconciling intellectual understanding with experiential sensibility, and to constantly work towards a reconciliation of those.
And when you mention when the ritual is internalized, then it has a meaning which is just contained in the ritual itself, or something. It's a rather complicated way to end it. But we have to kind of circle towards these kind of questions as the literal iterations of yoga perhaps can't be. I'm doing something significant, because it's externally X, Y, Z. Therefore, it will lead me to heaven or enlightenment or whatever, rather than locating it in the experience of. Which was always the yoga's intention, locate it in the experience of one's own body, and a kind of visceral embodiment of the inner world, whatever that however that pertains to the individual.
Yeah, certainly the internalization of the sacrifice as kind of a trope that helps us to understand the logic that connects the embodied practice to the soteriological possibilities is one that in some ways articulates in a very detailed way what I was trying to get at in terms of linking an intellectual approach to the embodied experience. And so I think that there is an element of that in the history of yoga as well, which is to constantly question the possibility of what the body can achieve, what we can achieve, I should say, as people. But to push that question, but never push it to an extent where we lose touch with the reality of the experience of the lived body in the here and now.
It's a very opposite kind of anthropological relativist perspective to note to end on, but you are an anthropologist, and if you
for better or worse.
Yes, for better or for worse, exactly. But very much for better. For better, his work is fantastic. If people haven't read any of Joseph's work, I really highly recommend it. It's fantastic stuff, and we'll put some notes and little links in the footnotes of this. So thank you again, Joseph, for your time and your patience with me, and it's been a wonderful chat, and I've really appreciated it. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's always a wonderful opportunity to be able to engage in conversations such as this. It's been very stimulating. Thank you.
Thank you. Very charitable.